Elijah sat by the window, pencil tapping against his notebook in a steady rhythm. It wasn't nervous energy, just a habit, one his mother had always told him to break. But it helped him think. The classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, buzzed with the usual pre-lesson chatter, but Elijah kept his focus on his worksheet. He liked getting things done early. At the front of the room, Miss Abigail Thornton flipped through her notes. She had been teaching 6th grade for nearly 15 years, known for being strict but fair, at least, to the students she favored. Elijah was not one of them. It wasn't outright hostility. She never raised her voice or insulted him. But she rarely called on him when he raised his hand. When he answered correctly, she moved on quickly. If he got a question wrong, rare as it was, she lingered, as if savoring the moment. Elijah noticed. So did his classmates. "Yo, she barely even looks at you, Tyler," the boy sitting next to him whispered one afternoon. "You got, like, teacher invisibility or something?" Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess I do." There was no clear reason why Miss Thornton treated him this way. He wasn't disruptive. He did his work. He wasn't the loudest kid in class, but he wasn't quiet either. If anything, he was just another student trying to make it through the school year. Yet, she overlooked him. It wasn't just about ignoring him when his hand was raised. It was the way her eyes skimmed past him during discussions, the way she never acknowledged his work with the same nod of approval she gave others. If another student gave the same answer he did, she praised them. But when it came from Elijah, she barely reacted. For a long time, Elijah told himself it didn't matter. Teachers had favorites. That's just how it was. But deep down, it did matter. No kid wants to feel invisible, especially not in a place where they're supposed to be learning and growing. And it wasn't just him who saw it. Other students noticed too, even if they didn't say much. A few exchanged glances when she passed him over for the 10th time that week. A couple of them whispered about it when she corrected him more harshly than she did others. It was subtle, quiet, the kind of treatment that didn't leave marks but still left an impact. And Elijah? He wasn't sure if he was imagining it, or if it was just another lesson he had to learn, one they didn't put in textbooks. Elijah had spent most of the school year feeling invisible in Miss Thornton's classroom. She rarely called on him, barely acknowledged his presence, and never seemed interested in what he had to say. But today, something was different. She had been watching him more than usual, not with suspicion, but with something else. Anticipation. The history lesson had gone on like any other. Elijah took notes, listening carefully, waiting for the usual routine. Then, something unexpected happened. "Elijah," Miss Thornton said suddenly. His head snapped up. She never called on him. He sat up straighter, scanning the board for the question. "Why don't you answer this one?" Her voice was crisp, almost amused. Elijah hesitated for only a second before answering. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. She tilted her head. Not bad. It was a textbook perfect answer, and yet her reaction was lukewarm at best. A few students exchanged glances. Tyler shot him a look that said, "What was that about?" The lesson carried on, but the shift had been made. For the first time in a long while, Miss Thornton was acknowledging him. And then, right before the bell rang, she made her move. "Elijah, stay behind for a moment." A few heads turned, but no one said anything. Elijah took his time packing his notebook before approaching her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, clasping her hands together. About your grandfather. Elijah frowned. What about him? You said he was a musician. Something in her tone made the air feel heavier. He nodded. Yeah. He was a pianist. Played jazz. Her lips curled, just slightly, not quite a smirk, but something close. Interesting. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. You must have picked up a thing or two. Elijah didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure where this was going, but it didn't feel right. A little, he admitted. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good to know. The bell rang, and Elijah turned to leave. But her voice stopped him. Tomorrow, she said. Let's see what you've got. He turned back. What? She gestured toward the old upright piano in the corner of the room, its keys slightly yellowed with age. You'll play something for the class. Elijah stared at her. A few students had paused near the doorway, their eyes flicking between them. Why? Miss Thornton tilted her head as if the question amused her. Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you. Elijah knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. She didn't want to showcase his talent. She wanted to see him fail. But she had no idea what was coming. The classroom had never been this quiet. Not during a test, not during a lecture, never. But now, as Elijah's fingers danced across the piano keys, the only sound filling the room was music. It had started soft, almost hesitant, but not because he was unsure. No, Elijah knew exactly what he was doing. He had grown up listening to his grandfather play, absorbing the melodies and rhythms of jazz like second nature. The old piano in the classroom was slightly out of tune, its keys worn from years of neglect, but that didn't matter. His hands knew how to adjust. At first, some of the students had snickered. A few whispered, expecting a clumsy attempt, something laughable. But then the music took shape. A blues progression, rich and smooth, rolled through the room. His left hand set a steady rhythm while his right hand wove intricate melodies, building something far beyond what anyone had expected. The whispers stopped. The smirks faded. Elijah didn't look up. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather, for the years of practice, for every time someone had underestimated him. Then, he took a risk. His fingers shifted into something more complex, a series of rapid runs up and down the keyboard, a technique he had spent months perfecting. The melody soared, layering notes in a way that pulled the entire room into the moment. It wasn't just skill, it was passion, expression, storytelling. No one was laughing now. Tyler, his closest friend, leaned forward in his seat, eyes wide. Brandon, who had cracked jokes earlier, sat with his arms crossed, but there was no amusement on his face anymore, just something close to respect. Even the students who had never paid Elijah much attention before seemed caught in the moment, their expressions frozen in disbelief. But the most telling reaction came from Miss Thornton. She stood by her desk, arms crossed, her usual air of quiet authority slipping just slightly. Her expression was unreadable, but Elijah could see it, the shift. The realization that she had expected one thing and received something entirely different. And then, the crescendo. Elijah pressed the final chords with firm confidence, letting the notes linger in the air before they faded into silence. He lifted his hands and let them rest on his lap. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single clap. It came from the back of the room. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Tyler let out a low whistle. Damn. Brandon shook his head slightly. I didn't know he could do that. Elijah exhaled, his heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the sheer energy of what had just happened. He had done more than play music. He had changed something in that room. And no one, not even Miss Thornton, would ever see him the same way again. The applause still echoed in the air as Elijah sat back down, his hands resting in his lap. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking for approval. He had already said everything he needed to say, through the music. But the energy in the room had changed. Before today, Elijah had been invisible. Overlooked. Ignored. Now, that was impossible. Every student in the room had just witnessed something they hadn't expected. And more importantly, so had Miss Thornton. She stood by her desk, arms still crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't clapped. She hadn't moved. But Elijah saw it, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly against the desk, the way her eyes flickered with something she didn't want to acknowledge. For the first time all year, she wasn't the one in control of the room. A few students were still whispering, exchanging glances as if trying to process what had just happened. Some of them, the ones who had laughed when she first called Elijah up, looked almost embarrassed now. Tyler, still shaking his head in disbelief, gave Elijah a slow nod of approval. Madison, one of the sharper students, crossed her arms and smirked slightly, as if enjoying the way the moment had unraveled. And then, Brandon spoke. "That's it?" he asked, his voice cutting through the lingering silence. Miss Thornton's eyes snapped to him. "Excuse me?" Brandon shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, that's all you're gonna say?" He just played like, he gestured vaguely, like something you'd hear on TV, "and you're just gonna move on?" A few heads nodded. More whispers rippled through the room. Miss Thornton's mouth tightened. "This is a classroom, not a talent show." Elijah exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He met her gaze, unflinching. "You didn't think I could play, did you?" A murmur of agreement spread through the students. Miss Thornton's jaw tensed. "I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class." Elijah shook his head. "No, you didn't." His voice was calm, even. "You thought I'd mess up. That's why you asked." The tension in the room thickened. "You wouldn't have asked Tyler," Elijah continued. "Or Madison. Or Brandon. But you asked me." A few students leaned forward slightly, waiting to see what she would say. Miss Thornton's fingers curled tighter against the edge of her desk. "That's enough, Elijah." But he wasn't done. "You spent all year looking past me," he said, voice steady. "And in 5 minutes, I made sure you wouldn't do it again." A sharp silence settled over the room. Miss Thornton, for all her usual control, looked just a little bit shaken. For the first time, Elijah wasn't just another student in the background. And for the first time, Miss Thornton wasn't untouchable. The class had never seen anything like this before. Elijah had played his piece, the room had erupted in applause, and for a brief moment, the weight of all the assumptions placed on him had shattered. But what came next was just as important. Because now, all eyes were on Miss Thornton. She stood by her desk, her expression unreadable. But Elijah knew better. He had spent months watching her dismiss him, brush past his answers, and act as though he barely existed in her classroom. And now, for the first time, she was the one being watched. "Well," she said, her voice clipped. "That was unexpected." The applause had died down, but the energy in the room hadn't shifted back to normal. It couldn't. Too much had changed. Students glanced at one another, exchanging looks that said what no one wanted to say aloud. Even those who had ignored Elijah before were paying attention now. And then Brandon spoke. "That's it?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "He just played like that, and you're just gonna move on?" A few students murmured in agreement. Even Tyler, still stunned by what he had just heard, gave a small nod. Madison, sitting near the back, crossed her arms and smirked, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Miss Thornton's lips pressed tighter together. "This is a classroom, not a concert hall." Elijah took a breath, steadying himself. He wasn't one to challenge authority, not openly. But this moment wasn't just about music. It was about something bigger. "You didn't think I could play, did you?" he said, his voice calm, measured. Her eyes flicked to him. "What does that have to do with anything?" "You wouldn't have asked Tyler to play," Elijah continued. "Or Madison. Or Brandon. But you asked me. Why?" The room held its breath. Miss Thornton straightened. "I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent." Elijah shook his head. "No, you gave me a challenge. You expected me to fail." A ripple of agreement moved through the students. Miss Thornton's fingers curled against the edge of her desk, her carefully composed expression just barely cracking. "That's enough, Elijah," she said, her tone sharper now. But he wasn't done. "I think," he said, his voice steady, "you don't like being wrong." A few gasps. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the room. Tyler's eyes widened. Brandon smirked slightly. Even the quieter students were sitting up straighter now, watching something unfold that they hadn't expected. Miss Thornton's jaw tightened. "Sit down," she said, her voice firm. Elijah held her gaze for just a second longer. Then, slowly, he walked back to his seat. The room was still thick with tension, but something had shifted. Miss Thornton might still be the teacher, still the one in charge, but today, for the first time, Elijah had held the room. And she knew it. So did everyone else. The next day, things weren't the same. Not exactly. Miss Thornton still walked into the classroom with the same composed, authoritative presence. She still called on the same students. She still ran her class the way she always had. But the energy in the room had shifted. Elijah could feel it the moment he stepped inside. Conversations quieted slightly when he walked past. Students who had never spoken to him before glanced his way, some nodding in acknowledgement, others just observing him differently. Tyler grinned, nudging him as he sat down. Madison, who had never seemed particularly impressed by anything, gave him a knowing smirk. Even Brandon, usually full of sarcastic remarks, just shook his head as if he still couldn't believe what had happened. But the biggest change was in Miss Thornton. She didn't say anything about the previous day. She didn't acknowledge it. But she also didn't ignore him anymore. When his hand went up, she actually called on him. And when he answered correctly, she didn't rush past it. She didn't praise him, she wasn't that kind of teacher, but the difference was clear. She saw him now. At lunch, a few students stopped by his table. "Dude, you were insane on that piano," Madison said, sitting across from him. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5, Elijah answered simply. Tyler shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Elijah smirked. "Guess so." Across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton walked past, her tray in hand. Their eyes met briefly. And this time, she was the one who looked away first. Later that afternoon, as Elijah walked home, the weight he had carried all year felt lighter. He stopped by the corner store for a bottle of water, and Mr. Henson, the shop owner, gave him a knowing look. "You look like a kid who just did something important," the older man said. Elijah hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe I did." By the time he reached home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother stood at the stove, humming as she flipped a fillet. "You're home late," she noted, glancing over her shoulder. Elijah sat at the kitchen table. "Had a long day." His mother turned off the burner and sat across from him. "Good or bad?" He thought about it, about the way the room had fallen silent when he played, the way Miss Thornton had looked at him differently, the way his classmates had actually seen him. "Good," he said finally. "Really good." His mother studied him for a moment before smiling. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." Elijah chuckled. "I think I did." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "And how do you feel about that?" He didn't have to think long. Like it was supposed to happen. The next day, Miss Thornton continued as if nothing had changed. But it had. Some moments don't just pass. Some moments shift the way people see the world. She had spent the year looking past Elijah. And in 5 minutes, he had made sure she would never do it again. In life, we all encounter moments when we feel overlooked, whether in our careers, our families, or our communities. People make assumptions about us based on what they see on the surface, without truly knowing our abilities, our experiences, or the depth of who we are. Elijah's story is a reminder that sometimes, the best way to respond to doubt is not with words, but with action. He didn't argue with his teacher. He didn't demand respect. He simply let his talent speak for itself. And in doing so, he changed the way people saw him, not just for a moment, but in a way that lasted. This lesson is important no matter our age. How often have we been underestimated because of our background, our appearance, or even our age? How many times have we been passed over, not because we lacked ability, but because someone failed to see us clearly? The truth is, life will always have its Miss Thorntons, people who assume they already know our limits. But like Elijah, we have the power to prove them wrong, not by confrontation, but by showing up and showing what we're truly capable of. And there's another lesson here, too. As we grow older, we find ourselves in positions of influence, whether as parents, grandparents, mentors, or leaders in our communities. Are we seeing the people around us for who they truly are? Are we giving them opportunities to shine? Or are we unintentionally looking past them? True change happens when we recognize the value in others and when we refuse to let others define our worth. Because when talent, persistence, and self-belief come together, the world has no choice but to listen.